Good morning. Today is Sunday, Zayin Elul, 7th of Elul. It is the 15th of August, and we are studying the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. Today we're broadcasting live from Brooklyn, and today's learning is dedicated to Li'iloi Nishmas Chayalea Bas Aryalei Baal Shalom. This is a dedicated member of our class who isn't able to watch in the live broadcast, but he's devoted to following the recordings. And it was his grandmother's yard site on Friday. We didn't have a share on Friday, unfortunately, but we decided that we'll dedicate this week's learning to Nishmas, his grandmother, Chayalei Abbas Aryalei B'al Shalom. So that's what we'll be doing, Be'ezer Hashem. We are actually at a point in the Gemara where we're reviewing something that might be a little bit more abstract, particularly for us living in 2021 in America or really anywhere, because being that the world of karbanot does not exist, offerings does not exist, the way we experience and perceive our misdeeds are the way we do today. And so, everyone has their own personal relationship with Hashem, person that some people take their relationship seriously, and if they do something wrong, they feel remorse and they do teshuvah. And we have Yom Kippur, which is in just a month or so. And that's how we navigate our relationship with Hashem. Of course, in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, the time of the Mishnah, or at least the time when the Mishnahs were being formulated, where the Beis Hamikdash stood. So the Jewish people, and Rebbe Earl Schuster has dug into this a little bit. I'm grateful for that, to understand exactly how this worked. Rebbe Earl, it's good to have you on. But essentially, a Jew that wanted to observe the Torah's instructions as it pertained to misdeeds, they would bring an offering if it was done inadvertently. Now, of course, a person that does not know something you can't be prepared. It's unavoidable that there are going to be moments and occasions where you are a shogeg, where you inadvertently do something that you didn't intend to do. For example, someone serves you lunch, and you thought it was regular, and you find out that it was teruma and it belonged to the kohen. Well, if you didn't know, what could you do? Or if you had a lapse and you forgot that it's Shabbos, perhaps at a time that you couldn't look at your phone or your watch or your oven and see what day of the week it was. And, sometimes people are disoriented. Sometimes people are trying. There's many reasons why a person could do something unintentional. But part of that was, in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, was that if a person did inadvertently do a sin, they would bring a carbon. So that whole notion is very removed from our Jewish experience. We keep Shabbos, or we do our best to keep Shabbos, or we have the idea of Shabbos, we grow in Shabbos, but we don't have this notion of karbanos. And that's what our Mishnah that we've studied and the Gemara that's been analyzing the Mishnah has been reviewing these last several days. So until now, we were going through the Mishnah and finding the source biblically, or an allusion biblically to the fact that a person has varying arrangements of how they bring their karbanot, depending on what their lapse of awareness was. What didn't they know? So, for example, a person, as we discussed at length, may have never known there was a Shabbos. He wasn't given an education. He didn't grow up in a Jewish family for whatever reason. There is a possibility that a person lost track of time or didn't know that Shabbos is Shabbos. And thinks it's a Tuesday or a Thursday or whatever. Sometimes you wake up in the middle of the night and you're disoriented. And then there's the possibility that a person didn't realize that certain activities are actually in malacha. And depending on what the lapse of awareness was, what and how many offerings they need to bring could vary dramatically. We're now up to the point where we're going to start getting a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of what is considered a single lapse of awareness. What is considered a single lapse of awareness, and when and how do multiple acts potentially get covered by a single offering and not? And what we're discussing here, namely, is something called a helam, where the person, because of their lack of awareness or because of their confusion, did one thing that one Shabbos desecration, and then they did another Shabbos desecration. When can the atonement be a single carbon? When not? When do they connect? I'm not going to do the Gemara justice, so let's share the screen. Let's go through it. And let us share the screen. And just to know, today's Gemara will be slightly a slightly shorter session than usual. I mean, it's not atypical on a Sunday, so let's get started and see how much ground we can cover. And of course, being that we're studying this Gemara, Hashem's help, Mashiach will come, and boy, kid, does our world need Mashiach, and so we'll be ahead of the game because we'll already be somewhat oriented to different practices that pertain to the Beis Hamikdash. This isn't just relevant for Alan, our Kohen, or Dr. Pasternak, our Levi, but it's relevant to all of us because all of us will hopefully have the opportunity to live a life that's somewhat consistent. I'm sure there'll be some things that are a little different. You might have an app on your phone to help you figure out your carbonis instead of, but nonetheless, we'll be ahead of the game and we'll be connected and more aware, and the learning curve will be more smooth because we're learning this Gemara. Bear with me a moment. Here we are. So it's going to start off with a conversation between Rava and Abaya, going through what sounds a little confusing, but if we parse it right, it's actually not that complex. I'm actually just going to change the layout here. Alrighty, here we go. Amar Rava. Rava is going to review a certain hypothetical, and there's going to be a little bit of a debate about it, as you can imagine. This is the Talmud after. Hang on, just that. All right. Amar Rava. Rava says, Chatzar, if a person did Ketzira, one of the acts on Shabbos, one of the malachas of Shabbos, or Ketzira, which is to reap, to cut stuff from where it's growing on the ground or a tree. Katzar, you reaped. Vitachan, or ground grain. Kigroid greris, the amount of grain that is the volume of a dried fig. Why a dried fig? What's special about a dried fig? So Rashi right away tells us, Shiurhu l'chol isurei melachos shel Shabbos b'eichel. This is the volume to pass the threshold of being considered transgressing any food-related act of Shabbos. So there's a lot of Shabbos malachos are generally divided into different categories. And the first major series are steps in the process of going from seed to bread. So you have to plant the seed, you have to harvest, you have to plant the seed, and you have to prepare the ground, and you have to eventually harvest it, and then prep it. All of those, it's actually called stidur the pas, the process of making bread. In all of those areas, one is considered to have transgressed to the point where they need to bring an offering, when what they've processed is the volume of a gregaris, a dried fig. And that's what Rashi tells us. So, katzar v'tachan, he did either of these acts, grinding or harvesting, or reaping rather, and he was in a specific frame of mind. B'shigagas Shabbos. He thought it was Sunday, or whatever. He didn't realize it was Shabbos. Uzadeh malacha, but he knew the act is prohibited had it been Shabbos. Rashi, katzar kigageres v'tachan kigageres b'shigagas Shabbos v'zadeh malachas the melchai malachat. Now, what do you remember in our Mishnah? What happens if a person does multiple acts in the same lapse or lack of awareness that today is Shabbos? How many offerings would he bring to atone for all of those acts?
He's got to bring one for each one.
So our Mishnah, no, if he didn't know that it was Shabbos, then all of the acts done in that momentary lapse of awareness that today is Shabbos, he would bring a single carbon. I think probably the scenario that we could envision is you wake up in the middle of the night on Shabbos, and you have a total lapse of, you totally don't remember that it's Shabbos, and you switch on the light, and you pull out your phone, and you write a little note. I don't know, you could do a whole bunch of things, thinking it's a regular night, and then all of a sudden, oh, it's Shabbos, and now you've done 5 or 6 different events. Based on Mikdash stood, there would be a single carbon. So that wouldn't be complex. That wouldn't be the question that Rav is asking. If you did a series of acts, and for the purpose of our discussion, 2 acts, Ketzira and Tchina, you went outside, you pulled a few stalks of wheat off the ground, out of the earth, and then you ground them up for grain or whatever. So now, one lapse of awareness, that would be 1 carbon, but it gets more complicated, and that's why Rava has a conversation here. But then the person went back, v'katzar v'tachan k'gregeres, he went back. I suppose on that same Shabbos. Bizalin Shabbos, and in this moment, he has already come to be aware that it is Shabbos. But Shigas Melachos, he still did not know that these acts are Melachos. So basically, one day, initially the guy forgets it's Shabbos and he does a whole bunch of things. And then he learns that it's Shabbos, but he does the same things over again, not realizing that they are Melacha. So in a sense, this guy somehow has hit the jackpot of managing to act out two different hypotheticals, two different scenarios of our Mishnah. In scenario A, he didn't know that it was Shabbos. Scenario B, he didn't know that these were prohibited acts. Now, Mark, what happens if you know it's Shabbos, but you don't know of two different Shabbos acts that are prohibited and you do them? How many karbanis does our Mishnah advise you to bring?
Now you got to do one for each one.
Now you got to bring an individual carbon for each separate act of Shabbos. Okay, so here's what's confusing. Is there a way that these two events might connect and combine to allow one to bring less carbonot than you would otherwise assume, or not? And that's going to be our next discussion. But first, Reb Beryl, I'm thinking about it. We might have a very good opportunity. We should invest in hiring a software developer to build us this Shabbos. Mark, maybe you could help us develop an application to assist people in figuring out how many carbonates they need to bring.
Rabbi, I see a
Right after
different.
Shabbos. You can't run it on. You gotta wait till Shabbos is over to run the app.
I'm sorry.
Otherwise, you have to wait till Shabbos is over to run the app. Otherwise, you have to bring an extra carbon.
If you run your Shabbos app on Shabbos, you're gonna have to bring in a carbon too for that.
Rabbi,
Well, actually, I want
I
using an app on Shabbos may only be a Derabanan, actually.
Yeah,
Not
Reb
a-
Beryl.
I see a different problem here. The theory of a minimum amount of doing an avera, and it's not an avera, does that apply elsewhere? Could someone say I'm carrying but less than the weight of a dried fig?
Reb Beryl, you're asking actually a brilliant question. One of the big discussions in Jewish thought is as follows. There are minimum requirements or minimum thresholds to be liable for teshuva or carbon or whatever. And there's less than the measurement one might be off though.
Yeah, like
The
eating
question-
on Yom Kippur.
So for example, a
you're allowed to
person that's sickly and or has medical needs and they need to eat or drink, but it's not that acute. So many times the Rav will advise to drink small measures of water over longer than the time that it takes to eat. And thus they have not trigger the threshold of biblically transgressing or being in non-compliance with him. And that's indeed something that Rabbanim will advise a person if they're able to. That being said, the measurement here hits the threshold for carbonis. If one is lichatchila permitted, well, certainly one is not meant to do less than the shir. How exactly do we look at that shir? That is a matter of great scholarship, particularly in what we would call the achronim, which is the more last 200 years, let's say, of Talmudic scholarship. There's much ink spilled on the subject, and with Hashem's help, perhaps we'll have the opportunity to do some recap on that discussion as well. But for now, we're going through the building blocks of the map. So, but it's a very good question, and certainly worthy of attention, evident in the fact that a lot of attention is given to that question. So, good question. You're mechaven to the question of many great gedol. All right, but let's go back to our discussion. So, one person manages on a single Shabbos to do melachos. Let's, for the purpose of our scenario, two different melachos under two different circumstances. One where he doesn't know it's Shabbos, and one where he knows it's Shabbos, but he still doesn't know these items are prohibited. And now Shabbos is over. Maybe Shabbos isn't over. Well, actually, I think for the purpose of this, it's not Shabbos anymore. And then he finds out that on Shabbos he did ksira and tchina, two prohibited acts on Shabbos. And then he first finds out about the first round of Shabbos desecration. Then he finds out about the second round of Shabbos desecration. So now, how does this work with karbanos? What offerings does he have to bring? So let's read Rashi. The first awareness. And what happens is when he finds out about his initial round of malachis, he sets aside a carbon chatas. A carbon chatas to account for all the acts done in the moment where he had a lapse of awareness about Shabbos. Then he finds out that there's actually more malachas that need atonement for, where he knew it was Shabbos. So does he need to bring another carbon? So Rava says, Kitzira, Gereres, Kitzira. The reaping that was done when he didn't know that it was Shabbos provides coverage and drags along its friend, the second act of Kitzira. Utchina, Gereres, Tchina. And the act of grinding drags along the second act of grinding. So whereas usually those two second round of acts would need their own carbonus, here we have a unique scenario where a person is bringing a chatas, one offering, and that offering gives coverage for two different acts, and those two acts both get to bring along a friend, if you will. And the second act also brings along the second friend. So this is a little bit of a shocking development. We probably would not predict this had we been asked to game this out on our own. And yet, indeed, that is what the halacha is, says Rav. Should we try for the Rashi? Kitzira, Gereres, Kitzira. The carbon, the single carbon that's meant to atone for the reaping, brings along the second reaping that was done where he knew it was Shabbos. Shnia, b'kaparasa, utchina, Gereres es hatchina, hashnia, in ischapru kulan. And all four acts, two under one scenario, two under another scenario, all have a single carbon covering it, although usually that would not be the case. The kaimalan achal shnei zeisei chela belam echad inechayev ala achas. Why is this? So Rashi reminds us, because ultimately, in a sense, both acts were done still under a general banner of unawareness. And this is the halacha that's discussed as it pertains to consuming prohibited fats. As we know in the animal, kosher is complicated. So what do people think kosher is? I know we're going off on a tangent here, but people think kosher. Many people on the street think that kosher is a blessing the rabbi makes on food. That's obviously not. So what's kosher? So kosher means that you can't mix milk and meat. But kosher also means that you have to have the right animals. But even more precisely, within an animal itself, there are a number of portions of the animal that are prohibited and are not kosher. What is prohibited and not kosher? Primarily two main issues. You have certain chalavim, certain fats that in the temple time were associated with Hashem and Samigdash. And there's also, of course, the famous the Gid Hanash. The Gid Hanash. The Gid Hanash is the sciatic nerve and the veins and the sinews and the fats that are around the sciatic nerve. And for this reason, I know we're going way off on a tangent. For this reason, there are certain cuts of meat that are very popular in the meat-eating world that are very rare or not available in the kosher world. This is primarily the case in the Ashkenazic community because there used to be a role, well, there still is a role, there's a job called minaker, which is the person that removes the sinews and the fats and the parts of the animal that are not allowed to eat. But in America, with the commercialization of meat production, it seems like that whole field has fallen off the wagon a little bit. And it's many times cheaper for Jewish meat producers to sell off the whole hind quarter, which has those parts, to a non-kosher meat distributors and to not even bother with it. There are certain boutique meat distributors, and in the Sephardic community, and also in countries, I think, where it's a little bit more, retail or a single, mom and pop shop, where they still do this process of minaker, and you have the hindquarter. Back to our side, there's fats that one is prohibited to eat. Person eats two kazesim, two olive sizes of this fat in the same setting, same absence of awareness, it has coverage. And the laws that pertain to the fat would also apply to the laws of Shabbos, namely that because there is a single overarching lapse of awareness, a single carbon suffices. But that's not always the case. Here we're talking about a situation where he set aside a carbon first with Shigig Shabbos. He didn't know that it's Shabbos, and so it was one offering for two. And that ends up bringing two friends along. And folks, we're going to do this next paragraph, and I may wind down our share in just a moment. However, what happens if you first became aware of the second pair of Shabbos acts? First finds out that, did you know that on Shabbos, one of the things that Jew doesn't do is we don't harvest, we don't reap, and we also don't grind. And he set aside a carbon for the act of Kitzira. So now what happens is Kitzira, Gereres, Kitzira. Utchina She'ima. The single carbon for the second pair brings along the friend, the Kitzira. So you did two acts of reaping. You set aside one carbon for one act of reaping. It brings along its friend, meaning you have coverage for two acts of Kitzira, a single carbon. But being that first Kitzira that was done under the banner of Shabbos, the unawareness, not realizing that Shabbos, the Kitzira also brings along its co-act of desecration, Tchina. Kitzira, Gereres, Kitzira, Utchina De'ima. Utchina, Shekenegda, V'Kaimemedes. But the second, the fourth, the final Kitzira, Tchina, the final act of grinding, does not schlep along a friend. So again, I know it sounds confusing, but really we're talking about four acts under two different kinds of circumstances. And ultimately, the companion act is covered by the same carbon. The companion act that's covered by the same carbon is also able to bring along a friend, because really the unawareness was just they didn't know that it was Shabbos. And so all the acts are dragged along. One single act is not atoned for, it needs a separate carbon, and that is the other act of Tchina, the other act of grinding that was done with the awareness that it's Shabbos, without the awareness of it, without the awareness of the fact that it is a malach. That's what Rava says. Sounds confusing, but those are the facts. So again, you do four acts of Shabbos, two without knowing that it's Shabbos, two without knowing that they're malachis, depending on what you become aware of first. And depending on which carbon you set aside first, will depend on how much coverage you will get. That's go ahead, I'm sorry.
This guy started out, he didn't know it was Shabbos, and he didn't know that reaping was us, or he
started out not knowing that it's Shabbos. Then when he found that it's Shabbos, he
also didn't know the malachos were forbidden, though, because once he realized it was Shabbos, he still was doing it because he thought it was okay. Exactly.
Again, in today's world, it's hard. But in those days, let's say, person doesn't know, and then they start learning. But guess what? There's good news. Amar Abaya. Abaya disagrees. Says no. Tchina, nami, gereres, tchina. You basically have one Kitzira that drags along its friend, the other Kitzira. The Kitzira that it brings along is fused together with an act of tchina. I know I'm trying to give visuals for an abstract. And then the tchina that was fused, the two acts that were fused together because they were under a common unawareness, that one now schleps along its fourth friend. So basically it goes like this. You did an act that you didn't know was prohibited, but you knew it was Shabbos, and you set aside a carbon. That act reaches in and grabs along its friend, meaning you have to kapara for the act of Kitzira, although the circumstances of your unawareness were different. The Kitzira that dragged along has a friend Tchina, which is under the same unawareness, and so it comes along as well. Now that you've got a Tchina on board, it schleps the Tchina as well. So Abaya basically says one carbon will end up covering all of the four acts. Why? Shem Tchina Achasi. It is a single malacha called Tchina. Should we stop here, or should we do another 2 minutes? Shena, your father, what? All right, we'll just do a few more lines. This is a heavy Gemara. The Gemara asks a question. So we have Abaya and Rava who disagree on how far a single carbon can go to schlep along companion acts of Shabbos desecration. Two opinions. Rava says it schleps almost all the other things. Abaya says it literally covers all four acts that happen. The Gemara asks, does Rava at all hold? Does the Rava at all believe that a carbon brought for item A has the capacity, halachically, to bring along a friend because you did an act of harvesting or reaping without realizing it's Shabbos. And you also did an act of grinding that you didn't realize. And that drags along its other acts. Does Rava believe that there's such a thing as bringing along a friend? In Hebrew, gereira, schlepping along. In Itmar, we have a teaching in the other subject of prohibited fats. The person ate two settings, two portions of fats in a single moment, in a single lapse of awareness. And then he finds out that one of the settings, one of the dishes that he was served is actually prohibited fats. And when he found out, he right away set aside a carbon. He swiped right on his carbon act, and he reserved the carbon. And then, without realizing, the second dish that he was served was also chelav. He had a third dish. Amarava heavy carbon al rishain. You brought an offering on the first dose, the first batch. Rishon v'sheni mischaper, and ends up schlepping along the second. Shlishi enu mischaper. So what do I see here? That Rava doesn't believe that a friend brings a friend. That you can cover and schlep along for a single carbon multiple offerings. I'm going to give you the fast answer without going inside, and tomorrow, or I'll send you a notice to confirm tomorrow's shir, but we'll resume tomorrow. But basically, Rava had a process where initially he disagreed, but when he heard Abaya's explanation, he ends up coming along to Team Abaya. And so the reason why here Rava is anti-Greira, Rava does not believe that a friend brings along a friend. But ultimately, Rava evolves his position to be more Greira friendly, to be more willing to allow a single carbon for a single act to drag along additional sins for atonement. Reb Barrel, yes.
So, Rabbi, this would establish something for all sins. Again, I'm looking
Indeed.
at this. Is this a particular thing, or is this a general principle that we're trying to form? We can do that tomorrow.
It's unique to Shabbos for a simple reason. Or not a simple
now
reason.
We're talking about kashrut, so it's not about Shabbos.
No. So there's, generally speaking, the notion of the lack of awareness would give you would allow a single
I'm worried now about dragging along.
Hold on. The principle of dragging along is an interdisciplinary concept. Multiple different kinds of sins can apply Gereira. But the conditions of Gereira and Shabbos are unique in that most categories are a single kind of Aveira, and the question is, do they drag along or not? In Shabbos, it's uniquely complicated because sometimes we'll look at different acts of Shabbos as a single category, and sometimes we'll look at them as separate categories. The thing that decides if the acts of Shabbos are the same category or different has to do with what your lapse of awareness was. If you didn't know that it was Shabbos, so then all the different acts are considered a single desecration of Shabbos. But when you know of the individual acts when you know that it's Shabbos and you're just lapsing on the individual acts, so then they're considered like different others. So my point is very simply, the principles are the same but different because Shabbos has something unique about it. That is today, as you hear, the in-studio guests are determining this year is over. And so let's call it a day. A big Yasher Koyach.
Rabbi, I want to discuss with you, Mir Hashem, tomorrow, the same thing happening on Yom Tov, but let's not go there now.
All right, so hold on. I just want to close with two closing announcements. First of all, again, today's learning dedicated Lila Nishmas Chai Aleha, Bas Aryeh Label Aleha HaShalom. And number two, with Hashem's help at 11 o'clock, Dr. Pasternak Shalom Ber is going to be resuming in Mirz Hashem his Chumash class. So
thank you.
Just wanted to let everyone know that. And if you'd like a recording or you'd like to join, it's the same link. It'll be at 11 o'clock. Hashem. Dear friends, have a wonderful day. Be blessed and look forward to seeing you all again soon. Be'ezer Hashem tomorrow. But let me just confirm 100%. As I'm out of town, there is some influx conditions, so I'll keep you posted.
You're in Gullus. What can you do?
Yeah, I am in Gullus. All right, take care. Thank you.